There's a lot of discussion on the internet today about radiation risks, about what's happening at the nuclear reactors in Japan. And I want to point to Maggie Kurth-Baker's post at Boing Boing. She says she's in the process of putting together a longer post that will add some context to the concept of radiation. But she did actually, she's like, the nuclear scientists are a little busy right now. They're not responding to my emails because I'm not a priority. But she actually did get some good information from Dr. Catherine Higley, head of Oregon State University's Department of Nuclear Engineering and Radiation Health Physics, and says that information keeps changing from the Fukushima power plant as the situation changes, but one plant worker received a 10 REM dose. That's twice the annual occupational dose, twice what regulators have deemed safe for someone who works in a nuclear power plant. Now, the interesting thing about this, you may think, wow, twice the dose, that's horrible. But that risk translates into a 1% increase into having some sort of cancer or some sort of health risk related to that radiation. So twice the radiation does not mean twice the risk. Obviously, it raises your risk, but 1%, actually 0.5 to 1%, is a lot different. So I like, Boing Boing is doing a great job, by the way, of covering this and trying to bust through the FUD and say, you know, this is real. This is the PR that you're getting. This is what seems to be really happening on all sides of the issue, not just like, you know, busting the FUD of the power plant, trying to contain the information about what's really happening, but also trying to bust through, you know, people overreacting to the radiation issue. Radiation is a bad thing. I mean, I'm not saying it's okay, but you need to have some accurate sensibility about how bad it is in order to accurately estimate how bad the problem is.
Well, let me tell you, if you want to immediately cut past anyone's logic circuits and immediately make them scared, just mention nuclear radiation because it's so counterintuitive. It's this thing you can't see, touch, smell, or perceive in any way that can kill you. Nuclear fallout, of course, is a real problem. But one of the things that, and this is in no way meant to downplay the danger of the situation, but as people start throwing around the word Chernobyl, people really start to get worried. I want to point people to, there's a fantastic speech by Michael Crichton that you can find on YouTube. I believe it's called Fear and Complexity. And he talks about how he wanted to create a global disaster. So he looked up some research on Chernobyl. The initial estimates at the time were that 2,000 people died at the accident and that upwards of 400,000 people died through later complications because of exposure to radiation and cancers and that kind of thing. As he dug into the numbers, the actual numbers turned out that around 50 people died during the actual disaster, most of whom, about 30 of them, were fighting the fire live on the scene, and that's where they died. And that long-term cancers and infertility rates were such that basically only 4,000 to the day. Now, of course, the speech was written a while ago, and of course, there's some fact-checking to be done on that. But that is a massive difference from a perceived disaster to the actual number. And the one thing he points out that blew my mind was that the World Health Organization did a study on what the biggest impact of Chernobyl was, and they concluded that the number one negative impact of Chernobyl was not the radiation exposure, it was the perception of being told that you're going to die young, that you're going to be infertile, you can't have children, and that you've got nothing to live for. That's what caused the suicides and the early death rates and the unemployment and the malnutrition. And in this case, it wasn't that they were given bad radiation, they were given bad information. And as we do our next flirtation with this, it'll be interesting to see how our hyper-connected society tells the story of this potential nuclear disaster.
And it's actually the same issue we run in and talking about politics. You run in and talking about radiation, where if you start to say, look, it's not as bad as they're saying, all of a sudden people say, so you're saying radiation is fine. So you're saying there's no risk. And that's not true. That is not what we're saying at all.
Not at all.
But there is, you know, trying to find out what is the actual risk. There is a risk, but it's not helpful to say, like, it's radiation and therefore everyone's going to die. Because that doesn't help understand it either.
Helpful. It's actively harmful. Scientists are very familiar with something they call the nocebo effect. It's a negative placebo. They call it the death bone, the death rattle, where somebody points to you, they give you the evil eye, they say you're going to die, and people, sure enough, die. And so it's important that for the maximum health of society, that we be smart, that we avoid the radiation, that we handle the problem correctly, but that we not get wrapped up in this disaster explosion where we think that everything's over and it's the end of the days.
And what you need to do is you need to actually find good sources of information. Leo and I are talking about hopefully doing a triangulation with some nuclear scientists who can actually tell us, you know, what is happening, what are the dangers, what are the risks, what do people actually need to be worried about. In the meantime, you know, once you start to educate yourself on what, you know, the damages, what the real damages of radiation, what the levels are to be worried about, there are a lot of great resources online right now for finding out what the radiation is, not only in Japan, but elsewhere in the world. A live Geiger counter is at alttokyo.com, updates a graph with data every 60 seconds. There's also a Ustream channel broadcasting the digital display of another Tokyo Geiger counter. That's been crashing. It's getting so many viewer emails. RadiationNetwork.com is a crowdsourced radiation monitoring network of roughly a dozen or so unofficial monitoring sites around the United States. So you got to take that into account. It's very low number, very unofficial, but it's updated every 3 minutes, and you can participate in that by buying, you know, radiation detection equipment and going online. That's not something everyone's going to do, but if you're really into it, that's a great way to learn about stuff.
This is the BitTorrenting of radiation research here. When all of a sudden everybody, for example, their GeigerCounters.com is out of stock. They say due to the disaster in Japan, orders for Geiger counters has outstripped supply. This is fantastic. And again, it's a case where the hyper-connected society we live in make possible large-scale experiments and monitoring that never would have been possible even just 20 years ago during the Chernobyl disaster.
All right, let's move on to some of the first-person accounts here. We got one voicemail to 260-TNT show from Jason, telling us a little bit about what's going on in his area. Thanks so much for calling, Jason, and I'm glad to hear everything is safe for you. I hope you stay safe. I play this also because it's a fascinating first-person account, but also it emphasizes the importance of being prepared, as any kind of disaster like this always does. You know, having your 72-hour plan for whatever it is in your area of the world, whether it's tsunamis or earthquakes or tornadoes or hurricanes, there's something dangerous. Maybe it's a snowstorm that can happen.